All right, the last concept we're going to discuss in chapter 14 is the idea of an interaction between independent variables. So the definition of an interaction is a response of one explanatory variable depends on the levels of another explanatory variable. We call this interaction. So the response of one variable, that effect on the response variable depends on levels of the other explanatory variables. So our interaction model. So we have y hat equals b naught plus b1 x1 plus b2 x2. Oops. So we can see we have this interaction term right here. b3 times x1 times x2. So all we're doing is we're multiplying our two variables together. So what we've been doing up to this point is we've really just had one x1. We've had an x1 and an x2. In this case, we're just adding a third variable, which is just those two variables multiplied together. So what that means is without an interaction, the mean effect of x1 on y is just beta 1, right? It would just be b1 times x1. That's the effect of x1. But that's not the case here in the interaction model. In fact, when we look at the interaction with an interaction, the mean effect of x1 on y is actually beta 1 plus beta 3 x2, because x1 and x2 are linked here in this final coefficient. So the effect of x1 on y changes. It changes as x2 changes. So if x2, let's say x2 is a dummy variable, well then the dummy will now change both the intercept and the slope. So let's go back to our example and see how this actually works. And that was probably a little confusing, so let's make sense of it with an example. We have the same model as before, except now we're adding this third term. We're adding an interaction between horsepower and the transmission. So recall in the prior example, in our prior video, we didn't have an interaction, and so when we looked at the two slopes between automatic and manual, we just had two parallel lines. So in this case, that's not gonna happen. We're gonna have both different intercepts and different slopes because of this interaction effect. So let's say y is still miles per gallon, and this is actually wrong. This should say this is still x2 is equal to manual transmission, and it's 0 if automatic, 1 if manual, and x1 is equal to horsepower. Okay, so let's visualize this. Let's say, let's go back to our color. So we had manual transmission was greater than automatic. But instead of two parallel lines, let's now draw it something like this. So as before, so I'm going to say red is automatic, and let's say blue is manual. So just as before, B naught is the y-intercept for automatic, and B naught plus B2 is the y-intercept for manual. Okay, so let's write these equations out. Let's see how these actually would work out. So let's just plug in. So we have y hat is equal to, and maybe I should copy our formula down again, just so we can remember what's happening. So this is our model. So y hat is equal to b naught plus b1 x1 plus b2 2. So B2 is our indicator, right? It's either equal to 0 or 1. We're talking about manual, so here it's equal to 1. And that's going to be equal to, oops, I'm sorry. And then we have to add plus B3 times x1 times x2, which is 1, right? x2 is just equal to 1 because we're talking about manual, and so these just get plugged in for 1. So if we simplify this, we would have b naught plus b2 plus b1 plus b3 x1. Okay, now let's do the same thing for automatic. So we would have y hat is equal to b naught plus b1 x1 plus b2 times 0, right? Because we're now talking automatic, so manual is now equal to 0, or x2 is equal to 0, plus b3 x1 times 0. So when we simplify that, we just get b naught plus b1 x1. So you can see that we now have a different intercept, and we have a different slope. And so that's why we're getting, in our picture over here, we're getting two different slopes, right? This is steeper than this one. And we have two different intercepts. One's up here, one's down here. So if we wanted to think about our interpretation of these, so B2, let's look at B2. So B2 is missing here. So B2 is the difference in intercept between manual and automatic cars. That was the same as our prior example. Right? B2 is just the difference in our y-intercepts. But now B3, which is the new interaction term, it's the difference in slope of horsepower between manual and automatic cars. So we're saying that the effect of horsepower depends on whether you have an automatic or a manual transmission. So in this case, B3 is now that difference, because here the slope coefficient for horsepower is B1 plus B3, but down here for automatic, it's just B1. So that means the effect of horsepower on gas mileage depends on whether we have an automatic or a manual transmission. Okay, so that's it for interaction, and that's really it for this chapter. So in terms of dummy variables and interactions, the important thing is just to understand like the interpretations and understand the definitions. We're not going to be doing any of this by hand. So try to just get comfortable with the ideas and looking at some output, because we're not going to produce any output for these later concepts. In terms of this final chapter, we're really only going to do output for just the linear regression model with just two variables, no interactions and no dummies.